the Ascends of Boston Avenue podcast. My name is Philip Boone, and I use he, him, his pronouns.
And I'm Caitlin Drake. I use female pronouns, she, her, hers.
Before we begin, I'd like to say that the views represented in this podcast are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. We're recording this podcast remotely from our individual homes during the COVID-19 pandemic as we practice physical distancing as a church community. This podcast is part of a series that will visit the topic of race and religion. We start this conversation grounded in the United Methodist Book of Discipline. Division 1, General Article 5 says, Racial justice. The United Methodist Church proclaims the value of each person as a unique child of God and commits itself to the healing and wholeness of all persons. The United Methodist Church recognizes that the sin of racism has been destructive to its unity throughout its history. Racism continues to cause painful division and marginalization. The United Methodist Church shall confront and seek to eliminate racism, whether in organizations or in individuals, in every facet of its life and in society at large. The United Methodist Church shall work collaboratively with others to address concerns that threaten the cause of racial justice at all times and in all places.
Today our guest is Avery Marshall. Avery is the Director of Programs for the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice, or OCCJ. Hi, Avery.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me today. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm just really excited to be able to talk to you about a topic that's dear to my heart.
Well, we are so glad to have you. Can you tell us, just to start, Boston Avenue has partnered with OCCJ before, but could you tell me a little bit about the work that OCCJ does?
Yes, of course. So OCCJ is a nonprofit here in Tulsa. We also have an office in Oklahoma City, and we're dedicated to achieving respect and understanding through dialogue, advocacy, and education. We started as an interfaith organization, but now our mission is broader, but we still maintain a close connection to our faith-based roots with our programs. In particular, we have our interfaith study groups, our teen trialogue series where we gather teenagers together for interfaith conversations, and Boston Avenue was a part of that as well. And this year we talked to the teenagers about what their faiths tell them about justice and caring for other communities, and it was a really wonderful conversation. And we also have our youth interfaith tour, which we're doing virtually this year because of the pandemic. But our flagship program is the Anytown Leadership Institute. And this is a week-long camp for high school students who are interested in becoming change makers in their communities. And we talk to them about racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and we try to give them the confidence and the tools to stand up for marginalized groups in their communities when they go back to school or with their peer groups. And it's truly a really life-changing experience for the youth and the adults involved. When I first got involved with Anytown, I was an adult, and it completely changed my life just because seeing the growth that these young people went through motivated me even more to be a part of this the social justice fight that we're all in right now. But unfortunately, we've had to cancel the summer session of Anytown just because of the pandemic, but we're going to have programs in the fall that will hopefully fill that need in our community. And also for the adults, we have the Inclusive Leadership Institute and our Inclusive Leadership Collective. And these are opportunities for adults to gain professional development in diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. And we want to help create leaders who can create inclusive environments around.
When it comes to race, why does it matter? Some people might ask you, doesn't talking about race just make racism and racial injustice worse?
Right. Race matters. It matters. It matters to me. It should matter to everyone. I've heard a lot of people talk about how being colorblind might shield them from racism. But in fact, that concept perpetuates racism. When someone looks at me, an African-American man, I want them to see me. I want them to see all parts of me. It's an important part of who I am. I want to bring my race with me into any situation I go into without fear of discrimination or any other type of violence. We have to talk about race because when we don't, I feel like we allow for the most hateful among us to take over that conversation and use it as an excuse to dehumanize others. And, you can't solve a problem by pretending it doesn't exist. You can just ask my unopened mail. It's still there, and it still is a problem sometimes. And, I can't leave my race behind. No one can, and I don't want to. I want to bring it with me when I go places because it's formed me.
I think with topics that start to get really tense and personal for people, one of the most important things that we can do is make sure we're operating from a common place and a shared language. So in terms of words and concepts that we should know when it comes to this conversation, can you walk us through some of those key concepts, those key ideas, those key terms, and what they mean?
Sure. So one of the most important things to keep in mind when we're talking about race is to think about institutionalized racism, right? And what that might mean. And so when we say institutional racism, it refers to the systemic distribution of resources and power and opportunity in our society to the benefit of people who are white, with the exclusion of people of color. The current system that we are in wasn't built on a foundation of equity for everyone, unfortunately. And in the US, institutional racism has been responsible for slavery, Native American reservations, segregation, internment camps, and mass incarceration. And, even lately, we've seen that COVID-19 has been affecting communities of color harder all over the world. And this is because marginalized communities don't have as many opportunities for healthcare, and not to mention, the impact that adverse childhood experiences has on these communities as well. Institutional racism and oppression is based in unequal power dynamics. And the most privileged among us have the most power and are able to use these systems to their advantage, whether they mean to or not. They're still benefiting from it. And racism is rooted in having power over people of color. Another term that I think is important to look at is anti-racism and what that really means. There's a wonderful book called How to Be Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram Kendi. And in that book, he goes over different things that you can do to be anti-racist and the differences between what that is and what being an ally is. Allyship is important. Allyship is fundamental. But there's a difference between being an ally and being anti-racist, because an ally might be someone who agrees with what you're saying and feels for what you're doing and wants to support you, but an anti-racist is actively supporting you. They are actively trying to figure out, what can I do in this moment to make sure that you have the same opportunities, you have level of humanity that I do as well. Anti-racism means being actively involved in dismantling racism on the individual level, in the community level, and in the systemic level. I also wanted to talk about privilege as well, because it's something that is important to any conversation that we're having, and it's something that is very misunderstood. And it's a tough conversation to have, because people become really emotional about this topic. Because a lot of times people think when you say you have privilege, it means that we're saying that you haven't had any hardships in your life, or that you don't deserve the things that you have in your life, that you haven't worked for things in your life. And when it comes to race, privilege doesn't mean that your life is going to be easy, but it means that the difficulties that you're facing aren't about your race. It's about other things in the world. But people of color, they are constantly left out of opportunities, out of resources, out of power because of their race, right? An example of privilege may be, I'll tell a personal story that, affects me. So when I walk my dog every day. I'm walking down the river on Riverside, and, it could be a beautiful day, 82 and sunny, but I am worried about the way that I look. Like, I can't go on the river dressed in sweats and a hoodie and like a hat on. I'm worried that people are going to think that I'm a threat. When I'm with my dog, I can't, say he's sniffing something for forever, which he does. I can't necessarily tuck him come on, let's go, because someone might think I'm abusing him. Or, they might fall onto some stereotypes about black men and aggression and might think that I'm doing something that I'm not. And then I'm worried they might call the police, or I'm worried that something could happen to me in that moment. Our dog, he's a little aggressive around other dogs. He likes to bark, and he likes to just figure out what they're doing. And one of the things that we realized helped is he hates water. And so in the house, we have a water gun that if he starts barking, out the window, or trying to attack the window for whatever reason, we spray him with the water gun. And, my fiance, who is a white person, she started taking that on walks with her, and she's fine. But I had to explain that I cannot take that water gun with me when I go on walks, because that puts me in immediate danger. Say I pull that out of my pocket, who knows what could happen. someone is going to look at me differently than they're going to look at her. And that is privilege, that she can sort of do those things, that she can take that walk without having to worry about these different contingencies that I have to worry about. And that sort of is that privilege. I'm not saying that, she's done anything wrong or that she, is a bad person, but I'm just saying that she has that privilege because she is a white person. And that's sort of what privilege is about.
How do we talk about our personal racial identities? So, when you introduced yourself and kind of led with your lived experience, am I allowed to call you Black? Am I white? Am I Caucasian? Like, what are some of the terms around our own racial identities that maybe we should know or think about?
To me, being able to name your identity, to say who you are, is a part of building resilience. And so it's something that I have had to practice, right? It's not easy to sometimes just rattle off your identities. I've had to really work on understanding what identities are important to me and which ones I want to express. I am a Black, queer, trans man. That's how, I introduce myself to a lot of people. And when I do that, it says what I want to say about myself in that moment. And so I think a lot of the time we have to sort of think about, what do I want people to know about me, and what is important for them to understand, what's important for them to know in order to interact with me. And sometimes it's really helpful to just write that down and just say, I am these things, and this means that I love openly as a person of color, and I believe that my gender identity is as male, and so I just want these people to know these things when they interact with me, right? And it saves me against being misgendered or anything else. And so it's important to me. I think it's important to really sit down and talk with yourself and sort of think, how would I say this? Why would I say this? In which situations? So we can sort of build that resilience.
And for folks who start to feel uncomfortable in the language, so, we know that it's changed rapidly over the years of what is, I think a good example that I'm closer to is queer. Within the LGBTQ community, that word was a slur for a very long time, but has become kind of a reclaimed identity term. So the terms that we talk about when it comes to racial identity, the language that we used maybe even 20 to 30 years ago might not be the most appropriate language to bring to this conversation. What are some of the kind of more appropriate terms that we're using?
I've used the term people or person of color a few times already, and that term refers to people who aren't white, and just sort of a broad term for everyone. But it's important that when you are specifically trying to talk about a race, to say African American people, or to say Asian people. A really interesting term is Latinx. I don't know if you've heard that one, but it refers to the Hispanic community and to their LGBTQ community. But it's also very important to ask someone or to talk to someone about how they would like to be referred, because language changes, language constantly evolves, and whatever term we're using now might not be the way that someone describes themselves. And so it's always very important to mirror the language someone else is using about themselves back to them, because that ensures that you aren't overstepping or making them feel uncomfortable.
For people who feel that they aren't personally racist and they want to know, isn't that enough? I want to know from you, is that enough to just not personally be racist?
Well, in our current world, in our current society, that's not enough. Silence isn't enough to be personally racist and to just live in I'm not racist, so I don't have to worry about it. That's privilege. That's privilege right there, to not have to really concern yourself with it. To be silent when others around you are being brutalized, discriminated against. And even if you aren't personally racist, the people around you may be. And they may take your silence to the things they do or say as an agreement with their actions. And if you aren't personally racist but don't advocate or stand up for people of color, you're definitely not being anti-racist. And so it makes you maybe have to think about, what am I being in that moment? So no, I don't think it is enough.
I've noticed in the conversations, especially online, monitoring online conversations on Facebook or Twitter right now, this is a very important subject, a very tense subject, a very kind of all-in subject for our society right now. And one of the things that I've seen floating as an idea is this conversation around reverse racism, or the ways that people of color are racist themselves. And so I don't want to discount that this is complicated or that people have had lived experiences that have not gone well. But can you talk a little bit about this idea of what is racism in that situation versus maybe prejudice or some other elements that might be going on there?
Sure. So earlier I talked about institutionalized racism, systemic racism, and how it's rooted in power and especially in unequal power dynamics. And so when we're talking about racism, we have to look at the power dynamics at play. In racism, white people tend to have the systemic power and marginalized people do not. And so racism is using that power in order to dehumanize other people. The reason that reverse racism just isn't a thing or it just doesn't exist is because people of color don't have that same power. We don't have the power to take away a white person's resources or opportunities and things like that on a systemic level. And so that's why reverse racism doesn't exist. That's not saying that someone can't say things that are hurtful towards white people. That's prejudice. That is prejudice when someone has these views and beliefs towards white people that makes them feel little. That's prejudice, but it's not racism because the power dynamic is not there.
I know for me personally, I've done a lot of learning and changing throughout the years as I've learned more with my understanding of race and racism. However, no matter how much you learn, there's always more to learn and always more to understand throughout these topics. For people who don't have any experience in this area, what might they read to learn more, or what resources might they look at so they can learn more about race and racism?
A book that I love to reference is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. It goes into mass incarceration in the United States and a little bit in the world, and about how there are so many systems at play to make sure that Black and brown people are the folks behind bars. And so I think it's a really wonderful book to check out. I also suggest Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. Claude Steele is a social psychologist, and he talks about the way that stereotypes harm all of us. And it has this really wonderful concept, or not wonderful, but just really interesting concept called a stereotype thread, which shows that when people are at risk of fulfilling a stereotype, or they're worried that they're going to fulfill a stereotype, they become more fearful, they become more anxious, they make worse decisions, and they don't perform as well because their brain is constantly being bombarded by these thoughts about, I can't fulfill this stereotype, I want to work extra hard to make sure that I don't do this, and it's detrimental to their overall performance. And I think we can see a lot of stereotype threat in the world that we're in today. But I definitely suggest that, and I also suggest How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram Kendi. He also has another book, Stand from the Beginning, which talks about, it gives us sort of a history of race in America, which I highly suggest. And the documentary 13th on Netflix, it also talks about mass incarceration, and it's wonderful. It talks about how the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery except as a punishment for crime, which, is kind of the foundation of mass incarceration in our prison system right now, which is very eye-opening for me. Yeah, so those are some of the things I suggest. And also just finding the advocates that are in your city and follow their lead. This isn't the first time that they've had to mobilize a community, and I don't think it'll be the last, unfortunately. So learn who those people are and follow their lead, understand what they do, and don't make yourself the center of things, but just try to be a part of their movement and learn from them.
Another book that I've read recently that I think has been just good at giving me another lens was Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. And the film is now available to watch for free. And our pub theology conversation on June 9th is going to be about that film. So this is an invitation, if you're listening to the podcast before June 9th, to join us in that conversation.
I believe it's free through the month of June, so definitely watch it on streaming.
I'm reading Just Mercy right now, actually, so I'm really excited to finish it so I can see the film. I've heard it's really wonderful.
So you're one of those people who reads the book first and then you watch the film. Same. Mm-hmm. Totally same.
I'm an old school Harry Potter fan, so it's just what I do.
Me too. I have to read it before I watch it, just to see the differences and so forth.
So all of these resources that we're talking about are really great for adults who are maybe, starting this conversation or starting to learn or are ready to learn more. But I know a lot of friends right now who are parents, just kind of at that stage in my life. And I'm not a parent, so I kind of struggle to provide support in that area. But for folks who want to raise anti-racist children, who want to help their their kids or their youth understand this? How do you talk about it? Where do you start? What resources are out there?
One of my favorite resources for young people and young children is Teaching Tolerance. There's a website that it has so many great resources on how to talk to children about racism and all other types of discrimination. It has lessons, it has, testimonies from teachers and parents and sometimes even students. And it's just, they always pay attention to the nuance and the complicated nature of these conversations, but make sure to value the young voice, right? Because talking to young people about race is hard, but parents of color, especially parents of Black boys, have to have this conversation sooner than later. It's a fact of life. The world doesn't allow them to remain oblivious to the contingencies of race. And there's a lot of children's books that are wonderful for, one, self-esteem for young children of color, but also for young white children to understand in a way that is accessible to them and uses language that is easy for them to understand what they can do to be anti-racist, to be allies, to be accomplices for their peers. I think that consistently teaching children that they should love everyone and see everyone for the various identities that they encompass is important, and it can be done. It has to be done if we want to make the future a better place, because these are the people who are going to shape it.
For people who want to do something, what are some actions that people can take?
They can donate money to organizations that are doing the work. They can, if they aren't able to be out there, money buys water, it buys legal fees, it does so much, and it's not callous, it's like, oh, money, what does that help? It helps a lot, especially in this kind of situation, in this kind of fight, because resources make the world go round. And also, you can volunteer. You can volunteer with OCCJ. You can become a member of OCCJ and learn about what we do to educate others. You can talk to your family members about why it's important to stand up to racism when you see it. You can trust and believe people of color when they say they've experienced something. Take their word for it and stand up for them. Hold the people around you accountable.
A lot of our audience and listeners have a connection either to our church or more broadly to progressive Christianity, and faith is an important part of how they operate in the world. So I wonder how your personal faith has shaped how you view this issue or the work that you do in the community and at OCCJ.
My faith shapes who I am. I grew up going to church with my grandmother, and I found Christ again on my own as an adult. It's enhanced my passion for making the world better for everyone, but it wasn't necessarily the foundation. The foundation came from seeing how my family has had to struggle in a society that devalues them. And now my faith brings me comfort in times of despair, especially because this work is heavy on the mind and the heart. And it helps me to make sure that I'm viewing others who are learning, or to meet them where they are with grace and love.
Avery, do you have any other thoughts regarding this topic?
We all have a role to play when it comes to dismantling racism. Silence won't cut it. Silence isn't enough, because silence is sort of what got us here. When good people are silent, bad things are allowed to happen. And that can't continue to happen anymore, because I think the world can be so beautiful, and there's so many opportunities that are being missed by people of color, by young people of color, by students of color. I want to see them be able to thrive in this world and in this city, in Tulsa. I want to be able to see them walk into a room and not have to worry about how they might come across for their own safety.
Thank you. And earlier you mentioned Camp Anytown, and I want to mention that again because I feel that that's so important, and everything else OCCJ does. Whenever people ask me about my foundation of my beliefs or what I think, I always say that it was as a youth. I went to Camp Anytown 20 years ago, and that's the foundation of my thoughts regarding race or the LGBTQ equality or any of that goes back to Camp Anytown. So I'm excited for next summer when it's able to run again. But yeah, definitely. Can you tell us what the OCCJ website is? If anybody
Yes, thank you. The website for OCCJ is www.occjok.org. And on there, you'll find information about all of our programs, and we also do diversity, equity, inclusion consulting. You can get subscribe to our newsletter there. You can figure out how to get involved, and you can also figure out how to become a member on there. And our members are people who help us continue the work, but they also get a few other perks. Like in our panel series, they're able to have a little bit more personal Q&A with our panelists, and we just communicate a little deeper with them about what we've going on, and that's how you can keep in contact with us. It's a wonderful organization that I feel very honored to be a part of.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been an honor. Thank you.
This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. Our producer is Alicia Urban. Our theme music was composed and performed by Wyatt Smith. Boston Avenue United Methodist Church is a progressive historic church located in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. Please check out our social media for more information on what's going on at Boston Avenue UMC. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you.